Okay, so I wanted to create just a little video about essentially creative processes from individual designers. And I wanted to pick three that I thought were substantially different but had nice overlap. So the first of all I'm going to go through is Thomas Heatherwick and his book Making, which is very much with an architectural bias of using craft and traditional processes but giving them a contemporary lift. Rem Koolhaas is known as not just a prominent architect, but also huge output in terms of books like this, which really dig into the history of architecture and in many ways the sort of reason societies and civilizations are the way they are, because of the past essentially. And then another one, if you haven't seen his work, brendandawes.com. Do check it out. Forgive me if he's watching this, but I know this is an old book of his, but for me it's still quite precious. There's a lot of the advice and sort of approach I feel is still as relevant, even if I'm sure there's lots of sort of updated things which would be nice to take a look at. So roll on the second edition. Okay, so kicking off with Thomas Heatherwick. I think this is a really nice example of how to interrogate a brief. As quite often when you're starting out, it's quite difficult to know how do I basically give shape to a very vague problem. And especially at university, you're often given deliberately ambiguous briefs because tutors are wanting to see how you react to it. So for example, this one, clay test pieces, with no predefined idea and a material that lets you make any shape you want, how much three-dimensional complexity can you give a form in a few seconds? So he's clearly just got a chunk here, squidged it really quickly. And again, the debate isn't about the complexity being macro like these, or whether it's micro like some of these little pieces here. That's very much how you choose to interrogate the brief, but he's taken it that way. But then he's also said, this is also clay, and instead of working it in a few seconds, I've chosen to work at it over a few weeks. And that gives a very different dynamic of complexity, working with tools as well, rather than just the blunt instruments of your fingers over a few seconds. So it gives quite literally a black and white polar opposite of how one can come at a creative brief, and in some ways play to your strengths, depending on whichever way he wanted to take it. So I think another example is also, dare I say it, one of the nice things he did with this pavilion towards, I think, the end of his degree was that I don't know whether it's chicken and egg, that he was bought by quite a famous designer, and that obviously threw him into some good circles, or whether he had already been spotted and did the commission. I've forgotten exactly which way around it is. But either way, it's not about sour grapes, it's just how the world works. So if you're still a student and you're coming up to your final year project, it makes a lot of sense to think, if I'm going to do all this hard work, what's the best way to engage people so that they take notice, or indeed I have something which I can springboard off of when I leave? And he's the first to admit there's many things which I'm sure he would do differently. I remember reading this, but it really sort of gave him a first serious crack at doing something to a high level. Obviously people were telling him it's not going to be easy, can't be done, and so it was a really nice project for him to just express himself and his attitude and be a little bit unconventional in that way. So there's some just really nice stories in this book, and I think again just sort of looking at things that you see as being very typical or everyday, like he's got a plank of wood and then figured out how could I fold it, and so it makes a little seat out of a piece of furniture. And again, sort of the reason I picked this one isn't so much because of the hate seat, but I think in earlier videos I've also said about the importance of sketching not necessarily be about perfection at all. And although I appreciate not everyone could do a drawing like this straight off the bat with no practice, this is also not high level rendering that takes tens of years to become expert in. This is a good couple of weeks of solid sketching practice, and you're probably at this level as well. So no offense to Thomas Heatherwick, of course, but I think even he would agree the point is he just got the ideas out of his head onto paper and then got into the workshop and enjoyed making it. So I think it served exactly the purpose it was intending. There's also some really huge projects that he did, such as these, huge sculptures that flow inside and outside of a shop front, basically pressed up against the glass, as you can see here. And it's just, incredibly ambitious at an early stage of his career with a big client like Harvey Nichols. So again, it's even though, should we say, it doesn't necessarily have the blood and guts of, say, Stefan Sagmeister's journey, which I've put in a different video. I think it's still a really authentic journey of how he built his folio, built his clientele, and I still find it a huge inspiration. And then, speaking to the engineer in me, there's certain projects like this, which this bridge has essentially pistons, hydraulics that push together, raise the handrails and bring the whole thing round on itself. And in some ways the pictures do it some justice, but seeing the video in person, it's just a thing of beauty. And I think it's one of those things that he did which appears very simple and is just incredibly seductive and inspiring and, in some ways almost quite comical to look at. I've never seen anyone not smile when this thing operates. So, terrific piece of sculpture, art and engineering, and indeed it makes you wonder why we even bother having separate disciplines and classifications, because it just comes together beautifully. And again, I think he covers things like the Sea Pavilion, which I think wasn't just working as a thing that represented quite literally an entire nation on a global stage, but the conceptual and engineering integrity of this was quite extraordinary. Taking these glass rods, cast perspex rods, I think they were, and putting them into this structure which is hugely complex but ultimately simple at a distance. And he often jokes that this looks more like a rendering even though it's a real picture. And using space entirely differently than what people are used to. And I think when you get into the fact that this was, even before, various sort of climate change protests, he was still working with the seed bank to essentially provoke us to think about, endangered species, conservation, environmentalism, these sorts of things. So I think what's exciting is that this project really was a culmination of being aware of the political gravity that he could bring on an opportunity like this, but also doing justice to a whole host of other subcontexts and layers within it. So I think it's just, the work really becomes more sophisticated, but I feel without becoming pretentious. And I think that's a tough gig, right? So we all hope not to be down that road. So I guess the second one to get into, Delirious New York, Rem Koolhaas. It's basically all about the sort of the growth of Manhattan and the surrounding areas like Coney Island. And I think it's one of those things you take for granted how streets are designed, the grid system, especially in America. You compare it to London where I live, which is because it's a more ancient city. It's just total chaos because it's grown from villages and towns that have been amalgamated over, hundreds and thousands of years. So it's just interesting when you consider how something like this has grown in an entirely different way. And so, also, I didn't know when reading this that, Coney Island, the technology of the fantastic, basically this sort of place down here where, there's all these crazy ideas, which I think we'll get to one of them in a minute. This one's a great idea, of basically these sort of super high-tech globes. And these are truly massive. Whether you can just see the scale of the people down here, these are colossal structures which are absolutely mind-bending when you consider, how difficult they would have been to engineer. But this is what's amazing about history sometimes is, at the end of the day, stuff like this now makes Thomas Heatherwick seem completely achievable when people were coming up with things like this. So I'm sure people like that must look back and think, wow, history's so crazy, it's hard to believe sometimes. And then there's just quaint little sketches, like just at the turn of the century, here we are in 1909, this is an idea for skyscrapers of quite literally girders or whatever holding up houses with nice little gardens. Structurally, I suspect not very sound or feasible, but just, if it was kind of more quirky, you could see this being in a sci-fi or fantasy film. So, dare I say it, history can sometimes be crazier than the science fiction. Looking back at what people were thinking about. Of course, he goes through the sort of evolution of how skyscrapers started, of course having to be very blocky and rectilinear, until we got into sort of advanced engineering and simulation to pull off all these crazier shapes that you see. But, I mean, ultimately he's continually weaving in people like Salvador Dali and all the other people that may not consider themselves architects of brick and stone, but of paint and canvas and other things which were going on in psychiatry and all these sort of different molecules coming together to create different moments in time. And so I think this is just one of the really exciting things, if you see someone dig through the past in a really unusual way that brings a lot of, I did not know that, to a lot of the way cities are formed. But I think it yields an interesting creative process in itself, which when you look at Rem Koolhaas's work, kind of begins to make sense that his work exists through this, almost impossible to decipher mix of influences and things that he must take in by huge volumes every year, which is just incredible to think that he absorbs so many different influences, yet still has a very unique identity. So I guess if you were to believe, of course we could get into Dieter Rams, but I feel like Rem Koolhaas is almost more is more as opposed to less is more. But of course the ability for him to distill it into clear visions and very enjoyable books, I might add, is just terrific. So lastly, I thought I'd just, as I said, mention a very personal book to me, which was, again, a nice journey from someone who's been pretty independent his whole life. And, this book is just a mixture of practical advice on some things and quite a lot of, a bit like Thomas Heatherwick, just being willing to put on the page the question that they're willing to look at. Why does it have to be like that? Is Brendan's choice phrase. And this again was a little hack that he did for his website where here we go, he plugged it into a doorbell, so that when someone visited his website, the doorbell became a little chime that told him when someone was on his website. And of course this was back in the day when I'm sure he didn't have too many hits per day, and it's I would imagine pretty continuous bing bong sounds now, so it's probably been switched off. But again, he's just done sort of really for the sake of sometimes experimenting to see where that takes him. So this was using Play-Doh as a sort of input device for the speed of a Bruce Lee fight scene. And so depending on the shape of the Play-Doh, and it was using an optical sensor to see what shape it was, it would then speed up or slow down the progression of the movie. And I kind of just feel it's one of those things which is just totally bonkers. And again, it makes more sense if you go look online for this. So search Bruce Lee and Play-Doh and Brendan Dawes and you'll find it. But it's just one of those things that, there's a lot of talk these days about user interface design, but this was back in the early days of it. So I still think this book really holds its own as, like, dare I say it, being there in the really early days of what it all was. So again, just what's nice is also just little personal touches of his life, and this was what's in his bag, excuse me. And I just think these are always really nice touches. Just it gives a bit of colour to the person, not just this big philosophical white paper. And again, this is sort of a visualization of a Miles Davis track, Rocker, seen for a basic algorithm. And I stress this is basic, and if you check some of his recent work using things like Houdini, it's really taken on a level where I'm sure for him this just looks like child's play. But really extraordinary to sort of sometimes have this and remember this is where everyone starts at the beginning. Again, if you know anything about Brendan, it's nice that he's a huge pencil fan. I'd say pencil aficionado, whatever you want to call it, connoisseur. But again, it's just nice to sort of add colour to people's, background, that there's little quirks and things that make them tick. And it's nice to embrace those rather than always just this very polished LinkedIn veneer. And again, just touches like this I just find really nice of designing for my mum. And again, before, you know, inclusivity and, you know, usability and all these buzzwords were around, sometimes it is just about, well, I was just designing for my mum and that was good enough. And I kind of feel that sort of genuine part of Brendan is always the thing that makes him just incredibly endearing and a lovely person to share space and thoughts with. So again, I think one of the things he acknowledges here is something called cinema redux. And I'd say that was one of the things that has ended up in the MoMA. So definitely finishing on a high back then. What has inspired the imagination of more people than any other in this series is the concept I call cinema redux. The basic premise is very simple. And I mean, this is Brendan all over. Can you distill a whole movie down to one image? And so here he tries to. And whether it succeeds, whether it doesn't, of course this is subjective, but he was really out there doing things with visual media and data in a really great way that I think is just an incredible journey to see in a book, and a bit of a privilege. So yeah, go dig it up. Hope these three are useful and provide some inspiration. Thanks again. Bye.